All right, everyone. Thanks, and welcome back to KUBAcast, the podcast with alternative takes on psychiatry, mental health, and so forth. That we've been discussing a lot of issues. You will notice I am again speaking in English, and that's because today I've got a guest on the show who is Sera Davidow from Massachusetts. And welcome, Sera. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Sera, I've read a lot about both the organization that you're a part of and you yourself. So let me know if I miss anything major. But you're the director of the Wildflower Alliance, which is a peer respite, and you're a mental health advocate and an advocate of trauma-informed care. And then you're an author who has written this awesome book. You're the primary author of this awesome book, Peer Respite Handbook. Did I miss anything major?
Well, the only thing I would say is that Wildflower Alliance actually is a lot more than the peer respite, but we do have that peer respite, and then we're actually about to open a second one as well. So I'm excited about that.
So the first thing I'm learning here is that you pronounce it respite and not respite. I was sure it was pronounced respite.
I've definitely heard that pronunciation, and I think it's, there's a variation that's acceptable.
But this is one of the words that, I've only ever read it and just assumed how it was pronounced. I've actually never heard it now that I think about it. So that I think I'm going to change my ways because you're sort of the expert on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I've heard peer respite. I've heard different things, but I think at least in the U.S., peer respite is the common pronunciation.
And so that's kind of the topic that I want to discuss with you today as the main theme. We may discuss other things, but I've been debating psychiatry since 2018, probably longer than that, but publicly since 18. And I am at the point where I think that the peer model of approaching human health mental health is both inevitable and fundamental towards creating change. So I am a strong advocate of creating peer respites here in Denmark. Would you put into words from your perspective what is actually a peer respite?
It's one of the things that we're struggling with here in the U.S. as we promote the idea of having more peer respites is how exactly to boil it down into a few words for legislators to understand, for example. That's kind of a test. Can we figure it out? And I think we're still figuring it out. And one of the reasons it's tough is because I think peer respite is such a simple concept in its way. It's creating this space where people can go instead of psychiatric facilities and other more invasive interventions and places where it's non-clinical home-like space where you can just be with other people who've been on a similar path and who've learned and gained wisdom from being on that path. And we can use that space however works for somebody. It's this, flexible space where you can sit and talk for hours if you want to, about where your life has been, where you want it to go, what you need to get there, what's not working for you. One of the phrases we use a lot is the opportunity to turn what gets called crisis into a learning opportunity. So there's lots of that, but there's also just space to do your own thing. One of the descriptions I love of one of my coworkers, actually, who before she was a coworker, she stayed at the respite. She said, I was talking with someone at the respite about how I usually go into the hospital, and they asked me, what do you get out of being in the hospital? And she said, well, sometimes it is helpful to just be in a room, away from the world, get some space. Yes. And just, she said, I hate to say this, but there's this element of being locked there and just getting space that helps. And they said to her, like, well, is it that locked in or that you're just away from the world? Because at the respite, you have a bedroom that locks. It just locks from the inside. And she said, oh yeah. And then she stayed there, and it was this life-changing experience for her. So that wasn't like a really concise idea of what peer respite is, but I think the bottom line is it's a space where people can go where they have power over how to move through the, again, what gets called crisis or the difficult times they're in. And there are people there willing to partner with them who've been through similar things.
I definitely recognize that from reading your book, but also I think I saw a talk you did that was filmed and featured on YouTube, where you talked about one of the points of the peer respite or the peer model is turning the expert role inside out. So who's actually the expert?
Right.
Because that fits with what you were just saying, right? Because you're the one who comes to our respite with your history and your suffering. We can't tell you what your suffering is due to. Only you can do that.
Right. Yeah, it's a space where I think people ask questions that don't get asked elsewhere. So like even just that question that was asked of my coworker of like, what do you get out of going to the hospital? And
Yeah.
sometimes people are just in this habit of going through these cycles because they think it's the only option or it's how they've been kind of trained to respond to things. But here's a space where we can ask you different questions. And those different questions aren't giving you knowledge. They're helping you uncover the knowledge in yourself, you know? And so that's very, very different approach. And it's not this, super sophisticated, complicated clinical approach. It's just like, how do we just get back to being with each other and trusting each other and supporting each other to discover or uncover things about ourselves so that we can live the lives we want to live.
That's one of the things I find the most difficult about doing psychiatry debate and being an activist in this field, that there seems to be what I've come to call a common sense problem, because it seems commonsensical that what you need when you're in a mental crisis. You need somewhere to feel safe. You need somewhere to feel secure. You need to feel like there's somebody who wants to listen to you and try to make sense with you about what's going on. Very few people would, without prior knowledge of psychiatry, put "I want something to pathologize my pain" at the top of that list. So it's like I sometimes feel like I'm going just a tiny bit insane when I try to argue this point, because people, professionals especially, will ask, well, we can't just sit down with someone and join their pain. What should that do? We have to use like methodology or theories.
Yeah, it's really, I think we make films as a part of our work with Wildflower Alliance, and there's one film, I think the most controversially titled film is called The Virtues of Noncompliance. And we titled it that because I think in each movement of people who've been oppressed, there's this work of reclaiming words that have been used against us. And noncompliance is this very violent language, I find, that is also language we've kind of reclaimed in our way to sort of poke fun at some of, or I don't know, like just change up how people have talked about us. And so I'm getting back to what you said. There's a thread
Okay.
here. But so when
Perfect.
when I say noncompliance is violent language, it's because for me, anyway, the people who hurt me the most as a kid told me, you're bad if you don't do what I tell you. And then I got into this system that said, you're bad if you don't do what we tell you. And it's the same message, and that was really harmful. But then we made this film in an act of reclamation that was about asking people, where would you be now if you had listened to the things you were told about yourself when you first entered the system?
Hmm.
And people talk about how they wouldn't have their kids or their careers or their homes or all sorts of things, and that it was the act of not listening that allowed them to get there. And there's this segment in there with kids. And, we don't publicize this necessarily fully, but the kids are my child, who's now 21, but he was, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and then my coworker's child. And we just asked them questions. And one of the questions was about doctors and why they do what they do. And they said this interesting stuff about how doctors think it's their job to know the problem and identify the solution, and they can't let go of that.
Yes.
And so we end up in this system where they're telling people things that aren't true, but that's because they feel it's their job and they don't know how to let go of that. And I think it's so interesting.
I mean, as a society in Denmark, higher education, all education is taken care of financially by the state. So as a society, we post so much money into training doctors towards identifying symptoms and then diagnosing and then treating. And then we shouldn't really ask ourselves, we shouldn't like wonder, why do they do that in psychiatry as well? Because of course they do. So this is not a problem of professions. This is a problem of power, because the medical perspective on mental distress is interesting in itself. I mean, if we could find some genes that would show clearly who would be likely to respond to trauma in a eating disordered pattern or in a some other sort of pattern, that would be interesting. But the dominance of the medical model, that's the problem from my point of view, which leads to traumatized people being re-traumatized. Like you just told your own story, right? I've come across that so much with clients who've been seriously harmed by this violence, by this psychological epistemic violence that occurs when you define someone as wrong, as pathological.
Absolutely. And in an interesting way, the problem that we're talking about right now is the same on both sides. Like not the power, not the loss that's involved, but this just sort of, so I don't want someone else coming and telling me what my life means or what my distress has meant or where it comes from. And there's this like great disconnect that comes in myself when someone tries to do that, and I'm forced to accept that in some way. But I think there's a similarity in its way to doctors and others who have invested like years and in many countries so much money to learning particular ideas and ways of being. And then someone comes and says like, no, it's not that way. Like there's so much investment in that identity that there's this like, yeah, this pain. The problem is that we don't have the power to say no. And doctors have all the power to say like, nope, I've got this identity and I'm going to hang on to it and I'm going to use it to silence you while I'm at it. And I think you're absolutely right too, that the issue isn't the medical perspective. It's that the medical perspective is like way above everything else and everything else is disregarded.
And that's actually a nice segue into my next question for you, because it seems like the US is, in some regards, ahead with regards to trauma-informed care when you compare it to Denmark in particular, but maybe Europe as a whole, because how do you have these peer respites? We don't have those at all, and I think we are quite a few people who are preparing like the arguments for building them, but the medical model is pretty much uncontested here. So how did it all start? How did you get the funding? How did you actually build this? Because that's just amazing.
Well, first I'll say, this whole trauma-informed care thing is interesting. It's, it's one of the buzzwords, right? And a lot of people say they have it. And I met someone at a conference maybe 7 or 8 years ago who said, when I hear trauma-informed, I think basically someone is saying to me, hello, we are here to inform you. We are going to traumatize you. And that's often what they mean by trauma-informed care because they don't really understand it. So yes, there is this focus on it. And then it's just one of those things that has been co-opted in so many ways. Right. For people to say like, no, we're doing it differently, but they're doing the same old stuff. But that aside, I do think you're right that in peer respite and peer-to-peer support in general, that there's this element of really, trying to understand what has traumatized us and not replicate that and create conditions that without needing to know each person's story, we can create those conditions where people are not being traumatized and re-traumatized constantly. And as far as peer respite goes, I used to say, and I'll tell some piece of this now, I used to say, oh, it really started in the 90s, basically, with there was something called a crisis hostel in New York and Ithaca that wasn't peer respite, but it started really recognizing the creation of a place where people can go, where not everything is medicalized, and there's a very different way of looking at things, but it wasn't specifically facilitated by people who had psychiatric histories. But then I think a little bit later on, but not much, just a few years, I think that Sherry Mead and others created the first officially titled peer respite in New Hampshire called Stepping Stone. And I think that started the history of looking at like, creating an alternative place that isn't a psychiatric facility where people can go. Like maybe we don't need the doctors. Maybe what we need is that space with other people who get it. And that said, I've been doing a lot of work in something called the Black Movement Leaders Project. and I'm one of the founders. There's three founders. Dana Smith and Chaku Matai are the other founders. And in uncovering some of the histories of Black psychiatric survivors in this movement, what I realized, I mean, I kind of knew, but I realized in a much more concrete way, is that there's this history of creating those spaces that goes back much further. And so there is a woman called Jenny Fulgham who in the 70s in Virginia created something called the Zuni Mental Health Federation using her own property. That very much sounds like a peer respite. It's just that, you know, given the history of the U.S., she didn't get the same platform. And so that history has gotten very lost. So we're trying to make sure that we start, you know, recapturing the histories that we can find the threads of. So I'll say that in terms of the history. But I think with that, Sherry, when Stepping Stone got developed, intentional peer support is also something that Sherry Mead really developed. And it's intentional peer support is another thing that if I tried to sit down with a clinician and say, if you go through this training, this is what it would look like, I think it would be hard to get them to understand the simplicity of it. But so much of it is just that being with. And then there's this component of it called worldview, which is that unpacking of like, what do you know about yourself? How did you come to know what you know? How might those pieces fit together in different ways than you might be thinking, and how to support someone to uncover their own wisdom, basically, and understand how they've learned to walk through the world in the way that they have, and what is and is not working for them. And that's really this focus of IPS. And I think that from all that history, all these other respites started to grow. And we were number 13. So
Okay.
so we weren't the first, but we were pretty early on in the process. And I think that's really what captured our interest. I mean, the Wildflower Alliance already existed. It was funded in 2007, but the respite came in 2012. And I think one piece that you kind of captured in something you said earlier, but one piece that gets missed that I think peer respite does capture, and that really appealed to us, is the impact of power and loss of power. And I think with peer respite, one of the most trauma-informed elements of peer respite is that you aren't losing all this power in order to get support. And so, you know, somebody can come stay at our peer respite and still connect with any part of their life that they want to connect with. They can continue to go to work if they want. We can get rid of all these assumptions that, you know, if you're really in crisis, everything else needs to stop and we just need to focus on treating you. No, like for some people, being able to be in a what gets called crisis and also still go to work is part of what helps them stay grounded. And so you have the freedom to do that. You have the freedom to not be diagnosed and have someone else interpret your experiences. You have all this freedom as opposed to this loss of power. And I think that for me, that's that trauma-informed element at its most, you know, foundational place. Is many people get to these points of distress through loss of power that comes from trauma. And so why would we try to fix that by putting on more loss of power? And that's what the psychiatric system does. So that's at the root there. That was our big appeal in 2012. And somehow after, you know, it took us like a decade or so of advocacy with our funding systems here, but we got a couple of people, I was going to say one, but there's a couple of people in that funding system to say, all right, yeah, we can give this a try. Now, part of the way you convince them isn't necessarily the way you convince us. Like that's the change. To be an effective change agent, you have to figure out what matters to each person. And sometimes to the system, it's just like, oh, will it save us money?
Yes, you know? yes, exactly.
And that can be dangerous because even if this cost as much money as the clinical service, if there was no cost saving at all, it's more humane, it's more trauma informed, and it's more effective. So we should still care. But yeah, So I don't know. I think I sort of answered some of your question in there.
You definitely did, and it's so interesting because whenever I talk about either in like when I debate in newspapers, I will sometimes mention how expensive the psychiatric system is, both in terms of effectiveness versus the money you put in, and also in terms of the outcomes, like how many actually do get better, how many lead positive lives, how many contribute in some way to society after psychiatric treatment. And those statistics are just horrific. I mean, this is a system that is not performing very well if we were to talk like just speaking from numbers. And one of the criticisms I'll be met with is, oh, so you just want to offer politicians a way to cut funding. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying it's incredibly expensive now, and it's not working. So maybe it's not a lack of funding that is troubling psychiatry. Maybe that funding could like be put to better use somewhere else.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think one of the challenges, though, is also how do we talk about that funding? So built into what you're saying is, yeah, we can look at the cost of a peer respite versus the cost of a hospital, although, hospitals aren't necessarily super forthcoming with exactly how much everything's costing, so that can be a little challenging. But,
Yep.
we can show cost savings there. But the biggest cost savings are in the fact that people aren't institutionalized for the rest of their life. They're not living in group homes.
Yes.
They're not dying and suffering severe health consequences from heavy psychiatric drug use for years. When they're able to look at a crisis as a moment in time, get the support they need, and then move on with life. And some people do need ongoing support, and there's nothing wrong with that. But other people, if the system doesn't do anything to make them chronic, they're able to have that moment in time and then move on. But we have a system that makes people chronic and that isn't even able to self-reflect on that. And so that's really like, we can talk about cost savings, life savings, all sorts of things. But, in this state that I'm in, which is, Massachusetts in the U.S., I was a part of this revisioning process with the state when they wanted to change. Most of it's just shuffling acronyms. So it used to be called CBFS, or Community-Based Flexible Supports, and then it was going to become ACCS, which is Adult Clinical Community Services. It's basically the same thing. It's their group homes, their group home system and their outreach system, whatever you want to call it. And I remember someone from our state Department of Mental Health, who's one of our primary funders, presenting to this group that was revisioning or giving input into the revision. And she said that, look, our satisfaction surveys to the people that we're serving show that after 3 years, their satisfaction rates go up living in these group homes. And I'm like, what? Like, do you think that you're measuring satisfaction, or do you think that perhaps after 3 years of living in a group home where you have no power basically over your life, you're measuring complacency? You're measuring
Yes.
like, I have become resigned to the fact that this is my life.
Yes.
And I think that gets missed in that cost analysis, really. And that's like a huge, huge expense in so many ways.
You can definitely measure outcomes that will seem to show that something is working, whereas the person who is supposed to be getting better has actually just surrendered to the power that you keep presenting them with, right? That makes a lot
Yeah,
of sense.
yeah, absolutely. And again, it's this, we can understand it in other contexts. Like people look at the adverse childhood experiences study, for example, and they can say like, we see that, if you have a parent who abuses you or you witness violence in the home, and you see all these things that you have all these poor outcomes. And yet there's an analysis that's often missing around how much loss of power that is, how much sort of people needing to adapt to those terrible circumstances is what we see when we see self-injury, when we see drug use, etc. But they fall short of understanding that that's also what's happening in the psychiatric system. Like when people lose that power, they start adapting, they start giving up, they start sort of this learned helplessness. And instead we call that treatment resistance. We call that whatever it might be, like, oh, they need to stay in our services because they can't be on their own because look at them. Um, yeah.
One of the psychological processes that I've noticed from working from a peer perspective is the rehumanizing effect of empowering people that way. Because psychiatry, one of the mechanisms that I've come to consider fundamental in how, if we ask ourselves the question, well, if psychiatry harms that many people, why are there that many psychiatric professionals who have no intent to harm others, who will say, I go to work, I do my job, I try to help people. Why is everyone on my back about this? Why is everyone on my case about this? But whenever a professional whose job it is to alleviate symptoms, to lessen symptoms, when that doesn't work, you become powerless. If the medication doesn't work, if the therapy doesn't work, then what do you do? Well, in a system where you have that much power as compared to the patient, then I think dehumanizing processes start. So you start to automatically dehumanize the person, first of all, in terms of their diagnosis. And I've heard that, I've seen it play out live. I've actually observed professionals do this to patients, and I don't think they're evil people, but the diagnosis is used against the person as a power tool in order to bring complacency and to coerce them into being the good patient.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you're making me think too of, I think for these systems to have any sort of, I guess I skew towards probably abolition because I worry that these systems are not fixable, but I also, in the spirit of reform, I
Yes.
do think that one of the things we've talked about in the world that I'm in is this idea of creating all this space for people in some of those roles to grieve. To grieve that they were misled by their education, to grieve the harm that they caused, because I think the vast majority of people have gotten into this work to not to cause harm. It's like to actually help, to support people. I do think that that's true. And then when they find themselves in there, and it's not happening, then yeah, they need to contort in order to maintain, to not cause this cognitive dissonance that is really painful to their identities. There's all this like effort to maintain that I think you're talking about there. And I don't know a way out without creating this space to grieve. And I will say, so we have this approach that we created around suicide called Alternatives to Suicide. And it is, I think, the first kind of peer-run harm reduction approach to suicide. But one of the things that people, when we're doing the trainings on alternatives to suicide, that often comes up is how many people have died? How many people have died? And, it's coming from this place of like, oh, if you figured it out, then you must be able to rescue everyone. And of course we can't, because it's this one approach in a world that people are still living in. We don't control everything. But that said, we've had very few people who are really involved with our groups die from suicide. I can actually, we developed this in, I think, 2009, and I can count, certainly still on my hands, how many people we're aware of who killed themselves. But two of them were clinicians. And I always think that's really interesting, because those clinicians were coming to our groups and they were saying, this is the only place I can take my mask off and be real, that I'm struggling too. And I can also talk about how hard it is that I feel like I've sometimes caused other people harm. And then they moved away. We didn't have groups online at that time, and they moved away to places where there weren't groups. And I'm not saying like, oh, if the groups had just been there, they would have been saved. But there is something about even, people in the clinical world, the mask they need to wear, and this sort of knowledge, even if they tuck it away, that they're causing harm.
Yes.
And I don't know how we really change these systems if we don't find a way to talk about that, because otherwise it does result in, the number of times someone has done something to somebody else, like put them in a psychiatric facility or give them labels or what have you, in order to manage their own feelings, is extraordinarily high. It's off the charts.
A fundamental paradox surrounding suicide. I think this goes for the entire Western world, where psychiatry is dominant. But at least in Denmark, I know that the statistic says that the time that you're most likely as a psychiatric patient to commit suicide is right after hospitalization.
Absolutely. So the risk goes up And some people have tried to interpret that as, well, that's just because the most severe cases, and I'm not a fan of calling people cases, but this is the language that gets used. Like,
I
the
know.
most severe cases end up in the hospital, and then we let them go, and we shouldn't have let them go, and that's why they died. Like, that's the interpretation people have tried to make, but it doesn't hold up if you look at the larger body of research, because the larger body of research says, like, actually, in addition to that fact, what we see is that people who've been in psychiatric facilities because they were suicidal, their suicide risk actually stays elevated for as long as 2 years after discharge. And people who entered psychiatric facilities for some other reason who weren't suicidal, their suicide risk is also elevated for up to a year after being discharged from hospital. And so, and by the way, we've also now done research, I think it was in 2019, that says if there's even a perception of coercion at the point of admission to a psychiatric facility, the risk of suicide is elevated at discharge. So that starts to tell us it's about something else, right? Like, we can't make those arguments that it's just like they needed more help, they needed to be in hospital longer. That is consistent with this story of, like, when people lose that much power and they get that hopeless, then there's less reason to stick around.
And I think we've got a system now in Denmark. It's pretty much the monopoly, but we've got a system now that if you're suicidal, there's just one place to go. If you reach out to someone while you're acting suicidally, then police will come get you and bring you to psychiatry. So all trips end there. That's where you go. And I remember I was employed within the psychiatric system in Denmark for almost 2 years right after finishing studying. And I remember suicide prevention, as it's called, is one of those really weird things where everyone acted so strangely, because as soon as a patient said the word suicide to me, this whole system kicked into operation where, had I checked off all the right boxes, was there something safe in the person's life? And it wasn't really about listening to the person. It was about, like, making sure that I'd done all those things that I'm supposed to do. And if I couldn't check it off enough boxes, then off to involuntary hospitalization with you, which is a really weird way to go about suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, especially since it makes people more suicidal, right? Yeah, but it's one of those situations where it's very much about, I feel uncomfortable having this conversation with you, and so I must do something to contain you so
Yes.
I can go feel comfortable. And whether that's happening at the individual level or the organizational level, there's also that. And I think Denmark and the US are quite different around liability, but there's still some piece of that in there of, like, we don't want to be looked at as being at fault, and
Yes.
therefore we must appear to have done all the things. Now, the fact that what we do now might lead to you dying later when you're out of our sight, well, we're not going to pay attention to that, because it's only, like, right in this moment where people are going to be looking at us and seeing us as at fault. And therefore, yeah, I wrote an article that's on Mad in America that is basically how often we tell people this is for your own good, when it's actually for our own good, like our own, like our organizational or individual good. It's for us. And it's just, all the time.
I remember this one client that I had in. I do take therapy clients now, and some of them tend to be people who've been exposed to a lot of psychiatry as patients. And one of them used this lovely dark metaphor where she'd always thought of her suicidal thoughts as a teddy bear. So, like, that's my teddy, she would call it. And that was actually the primary reason why she'd been given a psychosis diagnosis. I think it was schizophrenia, actually, within the psychiatric system, because they considered her talking to this teddy bear of suicide as something psychotic. But for her, the teddy bear feeling, the whole teddy bear metaphor, came from the idea that, well, I've lived a pretty shitty life and people have treated me horribly. If I wanted to, I could go out. I could leave on my own terms. And that had actually kept her alive. So thinking in terms of suicide as something that was comforting, something that, well, if I don't want to, if one day I don't want to anymore, then I don't have to, that had actually kept her alive. But psychiatry approached that like making that wrong, making her wrong for thinking that.
Yeah, that is actually really common. I've heard that story many times, that the idea that I have the power to take myself out is what allows me to keep walking forward. And that's not unusual. And there's other reasons that people have. I've also heard people say, I don't want to lose my suicidal feelings. I have this system over here that has decided that the problem to be fixed is my suicidal feelings, but my suicidal feelings drive my art. That darkness drives my art, my poetry, my music. I don't want to lose that connection. I just don't want to feel so overwhelmed by it sometimes. And so that's where the harm reduction piece comes in for me.
Yeah.
Because the harm reduction piece, I think most people understand harm reduction only as this, usually in the context of drugs. We give people clean needles, we do these things to reduce the harm until we can get them to stop. But that's not actually what harm reduction philosophy means at its root. What it really means at its root is I let go of the power to decide what is the problem for you. I let go of the idea that my job is to force you to move in any particular way with that problem. And instead, I'm willing to walk alongside you while you figure out how to live a full life, regardless of whether or not that thing I might have identified as risky changes or not. And so with suicide, a huge part of it, a part of the work of alternatives to suicide is simply being willing to be with someone and ask them, again, those questions that other people don't ask. What is going on? Was there something going on when that started? Is there, how does that work for you? Is there something that you get out of that? I don't mean in interrogation style, but there's so many different questions that can be asked that lead people to understand what those feelings mean. And instead we operate in a system that sees their job as just how do we squash those feelings. And those feelings have meaning. Those feelings can be read as messages. And yes, when you start talking like that, sometimes people are like, oh, you have another problem too. It's like, you're reading messages and finding meaning and things. But it's just so important. And we get in these power struggles. The system is engaged in this power struggle with people, and it is damaging whether or not someone learns to give up their power and just be hopeless and let people do whatever they want, or someone says, no, you will not take this power from me, and therefore I'm going to fight you. Neither one of those outcomes leads to actual support. I was on the rebel side. I was on the, if you're going to push me, I'm going to run away from you. Yeah. I'm going to not talk to anybody. And that's also really common, but it's not helpful. And I guess it's a little mysterious to me. At the same time, I also kind of understand it, why people can't see that, why people can't see that dropping the power struggle and just being able to sit and talk and be with people and support them to make meaning in their lives.
I know that Bruce Levine, who's another person who recommended me to strongly that I should contact you, he would point to this concept of consensus reality, that people construct consensuses around their understanding of the world, and what you might refer to as objective reality takes a definite backseat to whatever has been established as the popular mode of thinking. And I've come to adopt this concept of consensus reality. I do agree that because that's one of the only ways to explain all of this without making anyone evil, without thinking how can you intentionally do this? Well, I'm not doing it intentionally. I'm doing it within this other logic where what I'm doing makes sense. And then you could argue, but it doesn't make sense, does it? Neither scientifically nor with regards to the results. No, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's a conundrum, I feel.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say Bruce is great. I've also met with him. We interviewed him for one of our film projects in Ohio, and I love how he talks about how rebels get diagnosed. People who push against the system get diagnosed. So I love that. I'm sorry, I lost your question in there. What was it, or what you had just said? Can you just say, because there was something else I wanted to...
Yeah, what did I say actually? We were,
Oh, there's something good though.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. We're trying to tie together like why don't people get this? I think was the set off. It was like,
oh,
what?
consensus. Yeah, you were talking about consensus. Okay. Um, I mean, one of the things, so I do this bit in the alternatives to suicide training where I talk about how the evidence is kind of in the toilet for suicide risk assessment. So I don't know if you've looked at that data, but suicide risk assessments, there's not a single one of them that effectively predict whether or not someone is going to be suicidal. And yet everybody is trained in almost every training on suicide, whether it's a
I
clinical professional training or it's a, for the public training. It's like are you suicidal? Do you have a plan? Like all those questions that we're
yes,
trained to use. The best version of those apparently has about a 52% efficacy rate in predicting whether or not someone will attempt suicide. And sometimes you're like, well, 52%, that's not bad. That's about half. And then it's like, well, so you can achieve the same thing by flipping a coin.
yes, that's
You
chance.
can, yeah. And by the way, predicting accurately for that half doesn't actually say that you then have an intervention that's effective. It just says like, hey, we got it right half the time. And I read this article once, and it was from a psychologist, or a psychologist was quoted in there from Harvard, which is a very prestigious college in the States. And he acknowledged that. He said, it's embarrassing after all this research. We don't have anything better than just flipping a coin for our assessment tools, which was great to hear that. But in the next paragraph down, he says, but, these tools were created by people who have a lot of expertise and qualifications. And so we shouldn't dismiss these tools, basically. I'm very much paraphrasing. Those weren't his exact words, but that was the message. And I use that in our training to address this question. It's like, it's not a uplifting answer, but some of it is just who has the platform, who's making money, who does it serve. And so again, I know our countries are different in some of these regards. Our pharmaceutical industry here is, I think, one of the most powerful in the world. They spend tremendous money and advertise and all that, but nonetheless, there's similar themes, I think, however they're showing up in our different countries, that who has the platforms, who has the expertise, they don't want to lose that.
I can't count the number of times where I've made what I thought to be a very precise argument with specific evidence linked, both in theory and in practice. Like, these are the results. This is the reason why I think this should work better than what we're doing now. And I criticize something on scientific grounds. And the response is any variation on, Jonas, you do need to shut up because you do not have the rank to speak that way to these experts. Has always felt so weird to me. It's like, I don't care about his titles. He is wrong. But that seems to be valid logic for a lot of people in these systems. It's like, no, you can't possibly be right because the other dude is a professor, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's so frustrating, and it shows up in this whole theory of evidence-based as well. I don't know how that shows up in Denmark, but I know that here it's like there are times, and alternatives to suicide is just an easy example. We could talk about the hearing voices movement. We could talk about all these different pieces that the evidence is really evident in the people and the changed lives, but there hasn't been this, official whatever study that meets the qualifications that someone feels that it should meet. And things like alternatives to suicide, we've actually been told by people in certain conferences, like, well, we can't talk about that here because it's not evidence-based. And then we recently actually had a meeting with the National Institute of Mental Health here about alternatives to suicide because they have gotten interested in peer support and suicide and actually did this 2-day webinar. And I'm like, hey, we have this approach that is, I think, in this country, the only peer-led harm reduction approach. Why aren't you involving us? And we met with them, and it's sort of burned in my brain right now. We were trying to talk with them about research and how to research something like alternatives to suicide. And there was 2 of them, and one of them said, sometimes the most innovative approaches, there just isn't a way to research them in the way that we research. Well, okay.
Okay, then. So we're going to keep doing what we're doing now that isn't working because you can't figure out how to prove that it works?
That was kind of the message. And he didn't say it to be mean. He just
Oh,
said,
no.
this is the system that we're existing in,
It
and
was just
here we
stating
are.
facts.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, that's not a problem with the approach. That's a problem with the system, again. And if we continue down this path of like who has the credibility and what does research mean and all of that, I don't see how anything changes.
And that's why I feel like part of the future in a Danish context and probably also other places is because when I criticize psychiatry, people are saying, all right, so you want to abolish, you want to demolish, you want to abandon psychiatry tomorrow. And the interesting thing is I've been criticized for wanting that many times, and I have never ever said it, because psychiatry, I do, like you, feel like it should probably like be abolished at some point. I don't think that as a super tanker, I don't think that can be turned around anymore. But we also cannot just remove it because it's such an integrated part of society right now. But what we can do, which would actually produce the kind of evidence that they're requesting, we could implement alternatives that people could go to, and then we could have some sort of statistical analysis of who goes there, how well do they fare afterwards. I know that some of those things, like the peer respite handbook mentions some of the numbers, I can't recall them exactly, but just the reducing hospitalizations for those who seek respite care, those numbers are amazing, and in and of themselves would make it viable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you said you were getting called an abolitionist without ever saying it. We had the same experience here. People were saying that we were anti-medication.
Yeah.
And just look at their website. They're anti-medication. And I'm like, is there something on our website I'm not aware of? And it's like, look through. It's like, what? And at the time, we were way less vocal than we are now. And part of that comes from, how do we maintain these systems? We must discredit any threats. And if we
Yes.
perceive you as any kind of threat, the easiest way to discredit you is to say you're so extreme, you're not being reasonable, you're just trying to get rid of everything. And yeah, it's a strategy. I remember
Yeah.
I was in the UK, and I think John Reed, we interviewed him, and he said anti-psychiatry, it's like a diagnosis that people
Yes.
give you if they just want you to shut up,
Because they can't get away with giving you oppositional defiant disorder as an adult, so they call you anti-psychiatrist. That's the other thing.
Yeah, yeah, but I think it's tricky. I do think that some of these systems need to be abolished because I think their original intent, whatever the intent of the people who are employed in them, the original intent was not necessarily to do some of the things that we want to do. And so, yeah, turning it around would be very hard. And that's not generally how I approach my day-to-day work, because there's lots of people stuck in those systems, both working in and receiving services in those systems, that I don't think we can just walk away from. And it's a very privileged position, I think, to only focus on abolition. But that said, I think that, and I think I've lost again some other piece that you had said in there that I was going to say something about.
I mean, we were talking about, before we started recording, we were talking about chaotic conversations, popping in and out of threads. Yeah. I think it'll weave together beautifully in the end.
Okay. Yeah, there was somewhere I was headed that I just can't quite remember. I'm sorry. Usually I'm good with that, but this morning I'm a little like,
I'm sure there's a diagnosis for that as well, though. So
Yes. If you remember what you said, I can try and pull it back out. Otherwise, you can say. I assume this part will be cut here.
Yeah, if it works, it works. We'll yeah. We'll see. Maybe there's a humanizing process in that. You mentioned the voice hearing network earlier, and we've got that in Denmark as well. Actually, I just attended a seminar with them where they had a voice hearing panel of voice hearers talking about their experiences. And that's where I came to think of the term rehumanizing, because most of those hearing voices who attended there, they had been through the psychiatric, or they were still involved in psychiatric treatment. But what they were kind of talking about, and I asked one of them about it afterwards, is like, becoming a person again after having been a diagnosis, because the integration and the acceptance towards the voice hearing was so fundamental towards that this is entire me. The voices are also a part of me, and that has been made wrong and been made something to ignore and to kill for so long, that I feel more like a person now that is a part of me, because it is a part of me. I wouldn't know how to go about removing it, although voices sometimes do fade out. But I was thinking these two concepts of dehumanizing and rehumanizing. I do think this rehumanization occurs working within a peer frame. Would you also agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I think the Hearing Voices Network is really another harm reduction approach. It's like you're not assuming what the problem is, not assuming the goal is to get rid of the voices and all of that. And so I think it's so valuable in that regard. And I think harm reduction approaches in general are rehumanizing. It's like because of that, because you're not stripping someone of power, you're not stripping someone of autonomy, you're not stripping the very core pieces of who they are away. And I think that making this space for someone to actually be themselves without fear of being in trouble for being that person, that is so important. And I think that I've seen so many people in the psychiatric system introduce themselves as their diagnosis, introduce themselves as a client. It's like, hi, I'm a client here. I was like, okay.
Okay, sure.
I'm not sure how we continue to believe, and I don't mean we, you, me, and me, but like the system, how the system continues to believe that using all this clinical language, putting someone into these clinical boxes and inextricably tying their very identity to the psychiatric system creates the probability that they will see themselves as a full human that can move on and beyond the system. And so I don't know, I have been in Denmark. I have seen, I got to see where Ove Runciman works and some other spaces in Denmark at one point. But here we have this issue of people just chronically being stuck in these systems. And I do think that's happening everywhere or in a lot of countries. And again, like back to that session I was in where we were talking about the changes in systems here in the state, they showed this age demographic chart in that, and it was such an interesting story. Like their intention was only to show, oh, these are the ages of people in our services. But what was interesting about it was it had this sort of somewhat sharp up slope when we were in the younger years, in the teens to 20s. And then there was this spike around the 40s. And then it got to the 50s and it kind of went like that. And when I look at that, I see the story of these systems that dehumanize people. And I think that what it's saying is like people are entering when they're young and they're piling up because they never get out. And then they're dying.
Yes.
All in the system. Dying or going to nursing care, right?
Dying, nursing care, or just resigning, I'll stick to my drugs. I'll live without hospitalizations or active care from psychiatry, but I'm stuck in this life with this diagnosis, this identity, this limited life in a care facility or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's very much a process. I think that's a product of dehumanization and medicalization of people's very being.
I've come to talk about the process, to describe the process of helping clients leave, what would you call it, abandon, leave, something like that, a psychiatric identity. So depsychiatrization is the psychological process of abandoning these self-concepts, these diagnostical self-concepts. And actually one psychiatrist who heard of this said, he kind of thought that I was running around out on the streets and yelling at people, "Do you have a diagnosis?" Well, you shouldn't. It's not like that. It's like when most people who come to me are ready to do the work and they are willing to do it. And I just ask questions. So psychiatrization is not something I do to people. It's something that happens spontaneously when we explore psychiatric identities. So what does this mean to you? What does schizophrenia mean to you? What does bipolar mean to you? And the more we uncover these things, the more people stop thinking of themselves in these psychiatric terms, and then they're becoming de-psychiatrized, which just, I mean, the sky's the limit suddenly, because I didn't think that I'd be able to do anything other than, go to the grocery mart maybe once a day, and then I'd had to stay home. I couldn't see people. I couldn't do anything. But regardless of whether they actually become like what financial experts would call contributing members, they can lead better lives than they think they can.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I do think peer support, to get to your earlier point, is critical in this. I don't think it has to be peer support, as you're also demonstrating, because I think that if somebody's willing to do that work, if they hold these values and they hold this understanding, they can be a helpful sort of conduit to those discoveries. But I think peer support is especially well positioned because A, we don't have to unlearn all these clinical things that we are being trained to put on people. And B, our training really is to be present and explore with people. And also we do provide that component of showing that there's different ways to live our lives. If you're a part of a peer-to-peer community that is really well developed, and I don't mean sort of the co-opted under the clinical supervision peer-to-peer where they're just sort of being taught to parrots. I mean like really a peer-to-peer community where people have done a lot of unpacking of that internalized oppression and those internalized ideas and are living all sorts of different lives. Being able to see that possibility right before you is so powerful. But part of what you're talking about too is, people really do misunderstand that. Whether we're talking about psychiatric drugs or we're talking about psychiatric diagnosis or any of those pieces together, the assumption is that we are there to tell them not to do something, not to use that language, not to think about themselves in that way. And really, if people did that, and, occasionally it happens, but that's misguided and it's not what this work is about. If people did that, they would be doing the same thing in their way as the system by just trying to take more power. I don't want you to think about it the way this system taught you. I want you to think about it the way I want you to, and not just like focusing on what does that mean for that person. Now, it's not quite as harmful as the psychiatric system, because if I did it, I still don't have the ability to put someone in a psychiatric facility and force drugs on them. But I'm still in the process of taking power away. And what you're describing and what is at the core of peer support approaches is not taking any more power away, even if that person continues to have a medicalized view for the rest of their life.
Exactly.
If they do that by choice, by knowing all the places, the pathways that are available, and saying, no, but when I look at my life in the context of everything I understand about myself, this is the pathway that makes the most sense, then that is a successful outcome.
You wouldn't challenge people's worldviews in other similar ways. So if you want to be friends with someone, if you want to help someone, support them, and they're big fans of, I don't know, astrology or some other hobby, making fun of it or telling them that that's wrong is just the wrong way to go about allying yourself with them. So I feel the same way. We have a sharp rise in ADHD diagnoses in Denmark. I think you have the same in the US right now. It's an incredibly popular diagnosis, meaning that many psychiatrists are now doing that. And from when I debate psychiatry, sure, I'll criticize this diagnosis in and of itself, but when I'm sitting across from someone, it isn't important whether or not they want to continue to identify with whatever the diagnosis means to them. The important thing is just that. What does it mean to you? What does it mean in terms of limitations, in strengths, in terms of what you believe to be true about it and how you got there? But it's funny because you say, yeah, sure, you can help people in therapy. I would like to think that I do help most of my clients through therapy, but I am a strong advocate for a peer respite. I'm not a strong advocate for more therapy because I can think therapy in itself can be really, really violent and a part of the problem a lot of the time, because this one-on-one, really intense connection, it's good for some things. It can be good for some sorts of trauma exposure therapy, but all in all, most of my clients, I would rather send to a peer respite than actually help them in this context, because I think it would be more helpful. And then there would still be a room for therapy to exist, but I do think that psychologists are part of the problem, at least in Denmark, in that we have such a strong position to argue in favor of more one-on-one therapy, and I don't think that's going to be, the solution to this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And what I really meant was that I think you don't need to have what gets called lived experience in order to ask those exploratory questions and unpack
Gotcha.
with someone. I think that both can do it, but it's easier often in the peer support realm because we haven't been trained to do all the other stuff, and unlearning is
Yes.
hard. But absolutely, and I think one of the mistakes that the system makes that is not present in a lot of peer support, if it's done well, is the idea that in order to work on the problem, you must work on the problem nonstop. You must be talking about, you must be focused on. And I think those, there's, I'm sorry, there's so many pieces that are important here to unpack. I think in the hospital, it's interesting because often there's nobody available to actually talk about the problem. You're just being contained. And so in a peer respite, there's actually someone who could sit down with you and talk for hours about whatever
Yes.
you're identifying as the problem. So there's that. But then there's also the reality that it's exhausting and intense and sometimes misguided to only ever talk about the problem. And one of the things that can happen in peer respite is, yeah, you can just hang out and watch TV. You can
Yeah.
feel what
Yeah.
it's like to be a part of a community and connect with people without always focusing on what's wrong. You can do art. You can go for a walk. You can hang out outside, out back of the house, depending on, what peer respite you're in. And I think that so much of what is healing for people is not anything to do with talking about the problem. It's about getting to exist as a human being along other human beings, and feel connected and feel valued. And I
So
think that the system doesn't really recognize that a lot of the time.
I think the system doesn't, and I think a lot of professionals do not recognize that or think about that as much, because what you're talking about here, I would describe as sort of an ecology of mental health relations. Like, what is a healing relation? Because sure, it might involve talking about the heavy stuff, but a relation that you can heal in also consists of other things that a human relationship consists of, which is connectedness, which you do through humor and shared interest and shared activities, being sort of this imitation of a tribe, of this fundamental human nature for belonging. Uh, in that sense, I think that psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, professionals do tend to like take the problem, the issue, and put it into a context where it becomes defining, which is sort of an issue.
Yeah. We talked about Keith, I think, before we started recordings, a mutual contact of ours. And I always remember this one story he talks about. He works in a clinical system, so he oversees peer support within a clinical organization. And he always, he tells me stories, some of which I probably shouldn't repeat, but I'll repeat this one, which is that he said, he remembers he got this call from this group home, and from one of the providers there, and they said, we have one of your peer supporters here, and I just want you to know they're not doing anything. I said, well, what do you mean they're not doing anything? I said, well, they're just watching TV. He's like, well, are they sitting next to someone? Are they alone? She's like, no, they're sitting with the person they're supposed to be supporting, and they're just watching TV. It's like, well, okay, thank you. He's like, they're doing something then. They're doing their job. They're connecting. They're being with. It doesn't need to look like they're doing something to the person, It's this very weird idea. And some of this gets back to the humanizing, right? It's like, how human can someone possibly feel if everywhere they go, someone's just trying to do something to them, like they're an object to be fixed? Most of our humanity resides in just our general connections and connectivity to the world, and not even just people, but nature and, all these different things around us.
That actually brings us really wonderfully into the last point that I've written down that I would love to discuss with you, which surrounds professionalism and lived experiences. Because peer respites, I know of a few in England. I've interviewed what is called the Leeds Survival at Crisis Service, one of the directors from that, and what you're telling me about Wildflower. So many of these respites and similar places, they grow out of people with lived experiences as psychiatric patients. What I'm interested in, I've never been a psychiatric patient, but I mean, what constitute lived experiences? Because one of the diagnoses that would fit me really well is bulimia, and it's been more than hinted that either bipolar or autism would fit really well as well. So I've just had the kind of support and safety in my life where I haven't actually come across the psychiatric system. It's just been rough sometimes being in the darkness, right? What I would like to develop as a peer respite would be, how can we propose something where you're allowed to be a professional, you're allowed to not have been a psychiatric patient in order to work there, in order to be an employee, but you definitely have to be connected with your own lived experiences and be able to do the same with others, to sit with that darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so depending on what you mean by professional, so there's a lot of layers there. So in general, I'm really a fan of the experience doesn't need to have followed the same path. There's real value in having people working in our peer respite who have been in psychiatric facilities because they know that level of loss of power. And there's real value in people working in those peer respites who've never touched those things, who identify as trauma survivors, or who identify in having had these experiences in different ways, because they, for each person who works there who has a different story, then people who stay there get to see all these different stories, all these different ways of moving through the world with these different experiences. I think that's so valuable. As long as it doesn't mean that, say, the clinical world. So when providers try to construct peer respites, they tend to do it in a way that is closest to what they're familiar with.
Yes.
So they tend to say, oh, wait, hey, you've worked with us for 10 years, but I remember you saying you were in therapy once. Can you just go over here and be our peer? Because, we know you and you know us, and you're probably not going to make us so uncomfortable. So you have to watch out for that, right? That co-optation effect. And you also have to watch out for, when you say professional, so I do think it's problematic, say, to have a peer social worker, because peer is not just about identity. It's about how you interact. It's about the nature of your relationship. And if that person has the power to put you involuntarily in a psychiatric facility, then they're not your peer in that relationship.
Yes.
If they're evaluating you. So yes, I think people in a peer respite should have all sorts of different experiences. They don't need to have been officially branded as a patient, I think. And I think they need to be people who are not bringing in a licensure that says, and, if you say the wrong thing, then I could put you over here. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So how do we pull that apart?
No, I really connect with that, because I tend to forget that I am a psychologist, because I tend to say whatever I say as long as I think it makes sense, but I am being registered both by, people, clients, and professionals, whatever. But what I dream about is creating this peer respite, something similar to that in Denmark, where every employee is a peer within themselves. We're totally equal. There has to be a director, of course, something like that, taking care of paychecks and whatever. But when I mean professionals, I mean the profession of being a peer. So we would not employ anyone who didn't respond well to or live by those principles as professionals. So what is the being professional? Well, that is the being the peer. How do you do that? There's a whole, like you said, these are things you can actually train. You have a training program. You train people to live out this philosophy with people. And I think that's one of the things that scares some of my fellow professionals here in Denmark is like, but I can't just do away with methodology. I can't just do away with my schemas, with everything. And I feel like, yeah, I think we can. I think we could do that. And coming, like, if I had either the finances or the position to establish a peer respite, one of the fundamental qualifying things would be, do you know the darkness? Do you know the pain? What has your lived experiences taught you? And then it would be, surely it's relevant that someone is like a pedagogue or a psychologist. That's interesting. But just like people who are, saying hi, I'm a client. Hi, I'm a patient. Well, you shouldn't do that as a professional either. Hi, I'm a psychologist. No. Hi, I'm Jonas. I'm here.
Right. Yeah, it is so much about like how much can you let go of like whatever you've held outside of here and just be a person. And it's I don't even speak in the language usually of a peer because I think we can't be a peer. We have to be peers together. We're like you can't be a peer standing alone, right?
Sure.
It's about those relationships, and so. Yeah, are we really willing to be in those relationships and really look at who we are as whole human beings and our experiences and being willing to share that? Sometimes I get people in provider roles who are like, it's like, some of us have lived experience too. And I'm like, I absolutely believe you. And if you are not willing to really be in that and talk about that and connect around that, then you're doing different work. You just are. It's like, like what you secretly are holding still has value and it might inform your work and how you approach it, but it's not the same as peer support. It's just not.
And I think people have to discover the value of doing that for themselves before it kind of clicks, before they understand it. If you have been like either through traumatization or if you've been through the psychiatric system, then surely you do understand that because you've been under that oppression, you've been under that thumb. But it is something, the value of connecting with people as peers, and I'll make sure to use the plural from now on because that makes a whole lot of sense. But the value in connecting with people is something that has to be discovered. And I think that happens sometimes when I'm out doing presentations for other professionals, because sometimes they'll say, hey, Jonas is saying something controversial. Let's throw some money at him and have him say it here, see what happens. And one of the first things I try to do is try to make whoever is present talk about what they have experienced, share something that you probably haven't shared before. And it turns out that we've got so many eating disorders, even a few hospitalizations. If I've got 100 people, there are a few hospitalizations, a lot of people on psychiatric drugs, a lot of depressions, a lot of eating disorders. And they haven't really shared this with each other. And it tends to create, when it goes well, it tends to create this phenomenal vibe of love and community. And I always end up saying, so imagine you could do that, but for the people that you're responsible for, professionally speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that breaking down those barriers that like we need to maintain the we are us and they are them are incredibly harmful to us and them, like to both sides. And I think that people don't stop to think about that. And I think the exercise that you do, I don't know how you approach it, sounds really powerful. There's an exercise I do that's very different than what you're talking about, but is in some ways trying to get in like sort of underneath too, where I have this like card of 12 different things. And I start this exercise just by saying like, all right, let's read all these things out loud. So people read them out loud. They're things like, if I have what gets called a bad habit, I get to decide if I'm going to change it. Nobody's having meetings where they're talking about me without me present, like those sorts of things. And we read them. And then the next thing, and people don't know this is coming, but the next thing I say is like, all right, now look at those 12 and think about which one you're willing to give up first and cross it out. And then I say, all right, now that you figured out number 1, what's number 2 that you're willing to give up? Now cross it out and like kind of keep going. Sometimes I do more, sometimes I do less, depending on the timing. But you can start to see people getting upset or angry or saying things like, well, I don't want to give up any of them. Yeah. And then the punchline at the end is like, okay, Now think about how you felt while you also think about the fact that when someone enters a psychiatric facility or some of our group homes, they give up all of those at once, no choice. And let's talk about how you felt. And it's very different than what you talked about, and it has a different impact, but in some ways it's similar. It's like sort of erasing that line between us and them. It's like, how can we really think about that? Now, if I just went in the room and said, like, how would you like to have that happen to you?
Exactly.
People wouldn't, they'd shut down.
They would immediately reject that notion.
Yeah. Right. But this gets underneath that.
And I think that's so lovely, because you're humanizing the people under psychiatric care for them. Like, imagine if that were you. So you have created an exercise where people are forced to do that, need to do that, where, like, no, I wouldn't want to have that right taken away from me. Exactly. You wouldn't. Neither would the other person.
Right.
That humanizing, humanizing people who have been dehumanized is an interesting phenomenon, because I sometimes have clients who, in therapy, who have active psychiatric who have active psychiatric care, and very often it becomes relevant at some point to call up their psychiatrist, just introduce myself. I usually do it under the guise of discussing medication, because usually my client will have an ambition towards stepping down medication, and that is often not the case for the psychiatrist. But another ambition that I always have is like, I usually talk to them like 10, 15 minutes. I will try to throw in as many humanizing facts about the person as I can think of, like a fun fact about their childhood, a fun fact about something else, about their interests, about their hobbies, and also about adverse experiences. And what tends to happen is I will get a report back from both the psychiatrist and the person themselves. We're talking better now. We're talking better together now. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. It's, I like that approach, and I think I have found it sometimes challenging, but I'll have to try that more. I'm trying to think, like, when we've worked in psychiatric facilities, we have a contract where we go into psychiatric facilities, and we work with people who are there, and so often we're the only person who's really learning some of those things about them, and we have so far found, like, often there's this wall. But sorry, I'm not saying anything particularly articulate here. I'm just sort of thinking about it. I appreciate that approach, though.
Well, we've also pretty much completed my list of things that I absolutely had to ask you about. I've even managed to be somewhat polite, because I made sure to do how do you do the pre-interview talk. I wrote it down this time, yes, because some of my other interviews have been very confusing for the other person, I'm sure. And it just occurs to me that I just complimented myself without checking in with you whether I was actually being polite. So I might just do that as a finishing remark.
Yeah. No, I think you were fine. Like, yes, you definitely followed the social norms. That was the goal, right?
Yes.